I think the bigger issue here and the bigger conversation is about what happens when men refuse to bow, when they refuse to bend the knee. It's a conversation that is about the systemic destruction of masculinity that is, definitely happening from our current woke culture. But in addition to that, it's being perpetuated by the modern Christian church. Hey, and welcome to another episode of the Culture Cast. I am your host, Leah Steele, American patriot living abroad. And as you may or may not know, I also happen to be the mother of 3 sons, proud mother of 3 sons. I don't have daughters. And as a result of that, I think every single day about what it means for my sons to be growing up in the culture that they're currently growing up in, which quite frankly, I find actively hostile towards basically everything that God created them to be. And that's why this conversation and this episode is so personal for me. It's why it's so important to me. I am laughing a little bit because I'm like, wow, I guess we are just going to try to get canceled straight out the gate. But listen, I promised that we would be having the conversations that other people didn't want to have. I promised that these conversations would be controversial, that hopefully they would really get you thinking. And so I think that will definitely be the case with this episode today. We are going to be discussing the Tate brothers, Andrew and Tristan Tate. And I really just want to share, hopefully, a perspective with you that will get you questioning everything that you're seeing and everything that you're currently hearing about these 2 men. And this conversation, it really is so much bigger than these 2 men as well, and their controversial online presence and their history and their past and, their present, which is very active in the media at the moment. So I think the bigger issue here and the bigger conversation is about what happens when men refuse to bow, when they refuse to bend the knee. It's a conversation that is about the systemic destruction of masculinity that is, definitely happening from our current woke culture. But in addition to that, it's being perpetuated by the modern Christian church. And so, what we're seeing as a result is this growing trend of governments using the full power of the state to silence inconvenient voices or to silence voices that are not getting in line with their version of what masculinity should be. So, ultimately, I don't think this episode is about whether you should like or dislike the Tates. It's about having a conversation and beginning to realize what's at stake. Because the reality is if they can do this to them, in really what, is beginning to look like a global coordinated attack, then they can do it to your husband. They can do it to your brother. They can do it to your sons. They can literally do it to anyone who dares to challenge the narrative. So that's what we're diving into today. Hold on to your heinies. It's about to get wild and bumpy. Okay, so I guess we should just start off by talking about who Andrew and Tristan Tate are. If by some chance you've been living under a rock and you don't know who they are, I think, a lot of people know who they are, but don't really know the full history behind, their rise to fame, who they were, where they came from. And so I want to just give a little bit of history of who they are. Okay. So they are two brothers who have a British mother and an American father. So they actually have dual citizenship in the UK and in the United States. And that's really important to note. Okay. They were born in the United States. However, most of their life they grew up in the UK. And they made their fortune through entrepreneurship, investing, and really mainly really controversial online businesses. And then they became the most banned, most censored, most hated men on the internet. And that's happened a couple of times, right? But ultimately, like, why was that? Why was it? Because as you'll see when we talk later about the charges around sex trafficking, that wasn't the reason. That wasn't the reason why they were controversial. That wasn't why they became the most censored, most banned, most hated men on the internet. Okay. They became those things because they said things that men aren't supposed to say anymore. They started speaking out in a way that has become, completely unacceptable in today's society. So, what were they preaching that was so controversial? Well, they were saying that male strength is good, that men should be providers, and that men should be protectors, that weak men lead to weak societies. They were very outspoken about how woke culture destroys families, destroys nations, and ultimately destroys God's design. Okay. So their following grew really, really rapidly. And they were actually banned at one point from Twitter, from Instagram, from YouTube. They've now got their accounts back, but there was a period of time where they were completely deplatformed. So Andrew Tate's Twitter right now, I think, is close to 10 million followers. Tristan Tate's Twitter is over 3 million followers. Before his Instagram ban, I think Andrew had around 3.5 million followers. So he's actually become more popular. And this is one of the things that he speaks out on a lot, is that, the more people hate him, the bigger his following grows. Because men, and especially young men who make up the majority of his followers, they're starting to wake up to, if this person's, being silenced by the mainstream media, by our governments, why? Why are they being silenced? And so it's actually just continued to drive traffic to their social media, and to build followers for them. So yeah, literally, like, what we're looking at, because it is the majority are young men, though they do have a fairly large following of women as well. That's tens of millions of young men who are actually hungry for truth, that are desperate for leadership, that are disillusioned with a society that's telling them that they're the problem simply for being men. This is really interesting because when we made the decision to leave the United States, this was one of the reasons. Like, we were very, very aware of the emasculation that was happening and how rapidly our schools and our governments were beginning to push this narrative that it's not safe to be masculine. And we didn't like that. And we knew that kind of woke, we wouldn't have called it a woke mind virus at that point when we left the United States nearly 7 years ago. But we were aware that marginalization and oppression were becoming the most important things in the United States, and that everyone was, in this mindset of, like, not everyone, but the majority, right? And certainly the governing bodies wanted people to either be buying into a savior complex or that they were marginalized and oppressed. And our middle son is Black. And for us, we just didn't want him raised in an environment or in a situation where he was automatically being programmed to a narrative that he was marginalized and oppressed simply for being Black. And so I guess, this Tristan and Andrew Tate are half Black as well. For those of you that don't know, I am Black also. So I'm a multicultural woman, but my father was Black. And so, I resonate also with them, I think, from that perspective of, growing up kind of in two worlds and not really fitting in anywhere. But for me and my family, and for our desires, certainly for our youngest two sons, our middle son and our youngest son, like growing up believing that they deserved, that DEI was going to be a reality in their life was just not something that we were willing to do. Like, we believe that our children should be judged based on merit, and that we didn't want our children growing up believing that they were marginalized and oppressed and that they were due something simply because the color of their skin. So that is a little side tangent. But look, this issue of society telling young men, boys and young men, to not act like men, it's a problem that's been coming for a long time. And this is absolutely why I believe that the Tate brothers were targeted. Not because of their webcam business, not because of trafficking allegations, but because they actually began giving young men permission to stand up and be young men. So I really see this as like the real threat is masculinity itself. Okay. So this isn't about Andrew Tate. And Andrew Tate, for those of you that, aren't in the know, he really takes the forefront. Like, he and his brother Tristan, like, they're very close. They do almost everything together. But Andrew really is the spokesperson for the Tate way, I guess. But this isn't about Andrew Tate. It's about what Andrew Tate represents. And I think that that's really important. And it's important to get that across in this podcast straight away. Andrew Tate is a man who does not apologize for his masculinity. He refuses to say that men and women are the same. In fact, he's often joking about how women can't drive. And my husband and I joke about that because I'm like, I can drive, even though like he's constantly throwing that in there. But he's also a man who says strength, courage, and leadership are good, right? He is a man who constantly and continually mocks the weakness modern culture worships. He really just believes that men are becoming weak, that culture wants men to be weak, and he is actively and always, like consistently, always speaking out against that. And that is the threat. Okay? So the system doesn't fear criminals. The system doesn't fear men who are sex traffickers. The system fears men who can't be controlled. And that is who Andrew Tate is. Strong men don't rely on handouts. They don't need state or government approval. They don't crumble the second they're called toxic. And these are the things that Andrew Tate stands up for. He wants men and young men, especially, to start protecting their families, their communities, and above all, to stand up for the truth. Okay. And that is really unacceptable in a world that values obedience above all else. And I think, with the pandemic and, all of the truth that's begun to come to light, I think, like, you've been living under a rock if you don't think that obedience of the masses is the goal. Okay. And I want to just take a moment and talk about the modern church and talk about Christianity for a moment, because obviously, like, we're bringing a lens of Christ into this podcast. And some of the things that I do want to challenge on this podcast is the modern church and this kind of whitewashing or woke washing, if you will, of that church. So I absolutely believe that the modern Christian church is a co-conspirator in this weakness movement. The modern church is complicit in this attack on men. Pastors stopped preaching biblical masculinity because it wasn't seeker friendly, right? And they turned leadership into servanthood. And of course, like, we all need to be, servant-led leaders. That's not the problem. But the problem is that they stripped the strength out of male and masculine leadership. And the church has widely embraced feminist theology, which, I have to do a whole episode on the feminist movement and why I believe it's like the worst thing that ever happened to women and to our society. But they embraced feminist theology, right? And they told women that they should lead and men should follow. And we have so many issues in our culture today because of this. We have so many issues in our marriage. I mean, I was a person that like bought into this feminist theology and philosophy that created massive issues in my marriage. And, that's all stuff that has taken a lot of time and deep reflection to walk back. So, the church also started preaching compliance and niceness instead of courage, boldness, and strength in truth. And that's a problem because if we just go to what scripture says, right? 1 Corinthians 16:13, be watchful, stand firm in faith, act like men, be strong. The Bible commands strength. The Bible commands strength from men throughout. And the modern church is apologizing for that. And that's why men are leaving the church, right? And there is this massive thing that's happening right now where Christian men are becoming Muslim. And we need to talk about that. And Andrew Tate is one of those men. And so I think we do need to address that from as followers of Christ. It's an important thing that we need to look at. Okay, so I want to just like get their past out of the way here for a moment. And I want to talk a little bit about like mistakes, redemption. So look, like Andrew Tate, Tristan Tate, they are human beings. Did they make mistakes? Absolutely. Should those mistakes define them forever? Absolutely not. Because you know who else made mistakes? Rahab, David, Paul, right? We had a prostitute who was saved by God and then written into the lineage of Christ. We had a king who was an adulterer and a murderer, right? But still called after the heart of God, right? He was still called a man after God's own heart. Paul was a terrorist against Christians, was literally murdering Christians, right? Who was then transformed into the man who wrote the majority of the New Testament. God doesn't cancel people. He redeems them. And I think this is really important. And as followers of Christ, we need to look at this, right? Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Don't forget that. Like, as we're passing judgment on people, remember that. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And, I think I'm not even going to really go into like, yes, Andrew and Tristan Tate had webcam businesses. Yes. Did they exploit women for money? It looks and appears that way. I'm not going to go into all the details of that because Andrew Tate has actually like gone in and addressed all of these videos that pop up all over social media of him in his youth talking about women. He definitely was like adopting this, like, I'm a pimp mentality and, was young and ignorant in many ways, I think, and, living a life of flash and money and fame and, living the life of a pimp, right? And so I think, it's better to just let Andrew refute those videos in his own words and talk about what's happened for him since. But what I can tell you happened for him is that he leaned into his Christianity and then he actually ended up converting to Islam. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But something else I want to just address, like straight out the gate, is what is actually happening now in the United States. Because Andrew and Tristan Tate were facing charges of sex trafficking in Romania. And that case was ultimately dismissed. There's a lot of details to that case in Romania. And maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But the thing that's more alarming to me, because I'm not a Romanian citizen, I'm an American citizen, is that after 3 years, they were finally just granted leave to fly out of Romania. And they chose to come home to the United States. And they chose to come home to the United States for a month. Like, they're not permanently coming back, but they're grandmother passed away. Their mother has been ill, and they wanted to come home and see their family. Andrew also has 2 children that live in the United States that he hasn't been able to see. And so, they came home on a holiday. Okay. And upon landing in the United States, Ron DeSantis, once notified, came on TV and made public statements about how sex traffickers aren't allowed in Florida, and that he was instructing his attorney general to look into Andrew and Tristan Tate. Now, I think it's really important to note here at this point that they have not been convicted of any crime anywhere in the world. Okay. There have been no convictions. This case in Romania was dismissed. Okay. And there were some interesting details about how they left it open for the prosecutor to actually submit a new case. And so they are actually required to return to Romania. But they have been not only completely complying, but willing participants in this Romanian judicial system that has unfolded over the last several years. They're returning to Romania, I think on March 23rd, to go back, as they have been required by the Romanian government. So they're not fleeing. And, they have been maybe not in agreement with with the weaponization of the Romanian justice system, but they have been, doing everything that has been required of them. Andrew Tate was actually just a couple of days ago on the PBD podcast. My husband and I watched that in full, and I would really recommend, it's good for so many reasons. I think we had so many eye-opening moments of watching that, because personally, I'll just tell you, I haven't been a fan of Andrew Tate. I think he says some really valuable things when it comes to masculinity, but as a person, I didn't think I liked him, right? I definitely had my own judgments about him, about how I perceived that he had treated women, about the webcam business, all of that. And I will just say that PBD podcast was very eye-opening. I think it's 3 hours long. So it's definitely long. You could listen on double speed. I'll actually just link it here in the show notes. So you can go watch that if you want. But I think it's very eye-opening about what's happening in the world. Well, he went on that podcast, and he actually didn't share what happened to him when he came into customs in the United States. He was stopped. All of their electronics were seized at customs. They took their electronics from them. And then the day after, I think, the PBD podcast, the attorney general opened an investigation into Andrew and Tristan Tate in their home country, right? So I had a major issue with Ron DeSantis' statement that he made, because the fact of the matter is that we're talking about American citizens here, and American citizens that have constitutional rights, okay? And I was really disturbed by the fact that Ron DeSantis was essentially saying, he's not welcome here. An American citizen isn't welcome in America. That, he was instructing his attorney general to look into this, to look into 2 men who haven't been convicted of any crime in any court in the world. Okay. So let's just talk about the Constitution for a minute, because I think this is important. The law matters even when the media ignores it. The law matters even when our elected officials ignore it, right? So as American citizens, Andrew and Tristan have full constitutional rights. They hold American passports. I think this is really important. And they are entitled to due process under their 5th and 14th Amendment rights. And on top of that, they are presumed innocent until proven guilty. And that's not by Twitter, right? Not proven guilty by Twitter, but in an actual court of law, or X. Sorry, not proven guilty by X. And they have the right to know the charges, confront witnesses, and actually see the evidence. And so this thing that's happening on Florida, really feels like it's bordering punishing them before conviction. Now, I don't know that Florida's done anything unconstitutional up until this point, though seizing their electronics at the border may be considered that. So I'm sure the Tates have hired representation and are looking into all of that. But the ugly truth of this is that Florida's investigation isn't about justice, right? It is the political weaponization of justice that we have seen in our country, certainly intensely over the last 4 years. But it's not about justice, okay? It's about public optics, and it's about political convenience. And that's the part that really makes me sick, right? Politicians want to look like they're tough on trafficking. And the reality is it's easier to chase Andrew and Tristan Tate than it is to clean up their own backyards. Because if we actually talk about Florida for a moment and the statistics in Florida, I want to actually pull these up because I want to make sure that I am giving you the full and proper statistics on this selective outrage that we're experiencing in Florida right now. Because the Florida human trafficking hypocrisy is crazy. Florida ranks 3rd in the nation for human trafficking, okay? There were over 2,100 reported cases in 2023. And as we know, with our wide open border, it's got to be, astronomically past that. Many of these victims are children, obviously, who are trafficked between 15 and 40 times a day. So I just ask you, where's the moral panic over that, right? Where's the wall-to-wall media coverage about the trafficking that's actually happening in Florida? It's one thing for Ron DeSantis to stand up and say, we have a no tolerance policy on trafficking. Really? Well, what's happening right underneath your nose, right? What about Epstein, who was right there in your backyard? Where's the Epstein client list? That's still buried. And that's a whole other episode of the podcast, right? But if we look to Matthew 7:5, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This is just this is politically motivated is what I'm saying. Okay. So yeah, I feel like we have this political weaponization of the justice system happening. And potentially some violation of constitutional rights. And I think that's, it's really, really unfortunate. Obviously, the Tates are also now facing charges in the UK. And, due process is going to show us what happens there. But what I can tell you is they continue to beat cases. Candace Owens also did a deep dive onto the Romanian case. I think she spoke to Andrew for over a couple of hours. And if you know anything about her, she's like a dog with a bone. She read through the full case, and she literally came back prior to the case being dismissed and said, this case won't hold because there's too many holes in it. And in fact, it did end up being dismissed. So let's talk a little bit about Andrew's conversion to Islam and why that matters in the conversation. Well, in 2022, Andrew converted to Islam. And he didn't do that because he was spiritually lost, by the way. In fact, Tristan, his brother, still refers to himself as Christian. He does speak high praises to Islam, but Andrew himself actually converted. And he did that because he said he was looking for strength, structure, and moral clarity. And so some of the things that he has said himself is that Islam doesn't bow to wokeism, that Islam protects the family structure, that Islam calls men to lead and obey God. And so, obviously, that I'm a follower of Christ, and that I believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. And so that's not an endorsement of Islam. But it is a rebuke to our weak, apologetic, and compromised Western church philosophies, right? And this woke-washed Christianity. So I do think that we need to talk about the Palestine factor. And this may just be the thing that gets me canceled straight out the gate. But I think it's important to know that I think Andrew Tate's outspokenness on Palestine was actually the real trigger to the most recent witch hunt against him. Because the reality is that, he was sitting in a Romanian prison, then he was sitting in house arrest in Romania. And, like, yes, there were some hit pieces done on him. Yes, there were some conversations that were had on X. Yes, his following continued to build, but people had kind of forgotten about Andrew Tate, right? They were just, I think, content to let him kind of rot in Romania and deal with whatever, consequences he was going to have there. But he actually chose to speak out and speak up for Palestine. And that's actually when the proverbial gloves came off, right? Because what's the reality of our society right now? Criticizing Israel equals career suicide, right? Doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. It's simply questioning the narrative that makes you become enemy number one. Okay. So this isn't about morality. This is about narrative control. And what you saw happening when he came out and questioned what was happening, right, and spoke up for Palestinians was all of the conservatives who had kind of been on the fence, and I would, go so far as to say all the neocons who had been on the fence actually came out, and it was like, oh, the morality, oh, the sex trafficking, oh, he hates women, and this witch hunt against the Tates was rekindled. And personally, like, I just know that to be true. We've seen it happen with Candace Owens. We really see it happen with anyone who chooses to speak up for Palestine and speaks out against Israel. Now, that argument is way too nuanced to get into on this podcast. And I actually am planning on interviewing people on both sides of that narrative, because I don't want to present just one narrative on this podcast. So I'm definitely going to be interviewing some pro-Israel Zionist people, and I'm going to be interviewing some pro-Palestine people, because I think it is important to actually have the conversation. There is this phenomena that's happening around Israel right now. It's the thing you can't talk about. Right. And we know that when you can't talk about something, that we probably need to be scrutinizing it. When you're just immediately written off as an anti-Semite, if you aren't pro-Israel, if you hate Jews because you're speaking up for Palestinians, we know that there's a bigger problem at play. And I definitely think that Andrew and Tristan Tate have been victims of that narrative control that is trying to be perpetuated by our global elites and those that have interests in really, I think, all nations on earth. Okay. So, we've got the selective outrage, that's happening in Florida. We've got this Israel-Palestine factor happening. And I just think we can hold two truths at once, right? If Andrew and Tristan Tate did something wrong, absolutely they should be held accountable. But we shouldn't be going looking for things, right? If charges have been brought against them, then they should go through due process. And if a court of law anywhere in the world finds them guilty and convicts them, then great, we'll move forward from that point. I do believe in justice, and I do believe that they should be held accountable. But if this is political persecution, then we should be exposing it and we should be fighting it, right? I really just don't feel like it's in our best interest to simply buy the narrative that the media is pushing, right? Or, deciding that we're going to turn against two men because they're challenging a culture and an ideology that is leading to the destruction of the Western world. Political persecution is absolutely evil, and it's one of the greatest evils that we're seeing unfold in today's society. And so I just think that we need to really start to question when we see someone being canceled, when we see something that seems like, oh, there's just all of this, surmounting evidence against them, like they can't possibly be innocent. when you see so many people pushing a narrative, I think it's important to pause and be like, if this was a lie, if they were lying to me about this, why would that be? What would be the reasoning? And when there's some really clear indicators that that person that's currently being smeared or that they're attempting to cancel is actually standing up and speaking a message that's opposite from the mainstream narrative, that's opposite from liberal ideology or, woke mind virus narrative, I think it's important that we dive a little bit deeper and that we look a little bit deeper. And I think ultimately, it has to come back to the home, right? Andrew and Tristan Tate are somebody's sons. And it's, I think, really, really important for us to ask ourselves, are we raising bold sons or are we raising compliant boys? Because weak men do create weak nations. And our nations are about as weak as they can get at this point. And so it's time for us to start bringing our families to Christ, asking our children to behave like Christ. Christ wasn't compliant. He wasn't, following the mainstream narrative. He was actually doing the opposite. And so what kind of men do we want to be raising? Do we want to be raising men who are compliant, who roll over, who take orders, who are obedient? Or do we want to be raising men who, embody the true spirit of Christ and are really embodied in the way, the truth, the life, who are challenging the status quo, who are standing up for the underdog, who want to be providers, who want to be protectors. And that, I believe really it does start at home. But, I'm also having conversations with my adult sons about the Tate brothers and asking them to watch the podcast, asking them to dig into it. Don't just take what the media is telling you, make a decision for yourself. And I think that, men are sick of being treated like women. Men are sick of not being able to be men. And that is why the Tate brothers have gained such a huge, huge following. So, and then personally, within our own morality and our own values and our own moral compass, are you praying for truth and redemption, even for men like the Tates? Because even if they did make mistakes, even if they were convicted, they get a chance to be redeemed, right? A person isn't all bad. A person isn't all evil. There may be things that we don't like about them, but the reality is that their message is a strong one. Their morals, their values, their philosophies, there absolutely is a place for them to be heard in today's society. And I think that's why young men are flocking to them. The other thing I think we need to ask ourselves is, are we going to continue to allow the media to tell us who the villains are? Or are we going to make those decisions for ourselves? I'm not telling you after listening to this that, you have to love Andrew and Tristan Tate. I don't. But I do think it's worth investigating more. I do think it's worth watching the PBD podcast, potentially watching the podcast that Candace Owens did with Andrew Tate, and making a choice for yourself. Okay? Yeah. So those are my thoughts today. And, look, if this episode made you squirm a little bit, good. I think that, the fact that we have men leaving the Christian church for Islam should have us thinking. I think that it's the responsibility of the church to look at why they're losing young men. And, ultimately, you guys know, and if you don't know, I'll just say it again. I am not a fan of religion. I believe in living a life that's modeled after how Christ lived his life. And I am passionate about having a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I am passionate about, me and my family living a life that is committed to the way, the truth, the life. So hopefully this gave you some food for thought. And until next time, stay bold. Okay. Raise bold sons, stay free. And ultimately, never apologize for standing for truth. Never apologize for questioning everything. Never apologize for being interested in or willing to look at more than just one side of a narrative.